there. And this is your girl, Valerie Mason Chase. Welcome to Marriage Matters, brought to you by Marriage Beyond the Breach. I am so happy to have you joining us today. Now, I just want to put this out here. We are broadcasting through StreamYard, and I cannot always see all of everyone who has joined in. But if you make a comment, I'll be able to see that you're there, so I can give you a shout out. So anyhow, thank you, my sister Jackie. So happy to have you here. So today we're going to talk about something. You know, I hear a lot about trauma, and I hear the word said a lot: trauma, traumatic events, and that sort of thing. But what is it really? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I am so blessed to have with me none other than Deanne Weaver. I'm going to bring her on right now. Hey, Deanne.
Hey, Val.
So, you know what, Dan, I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you so much. So listen, everyone, Deanne and I were classmates at Cairn University. So she's my former classmate. We are now colleagues as counselors, and she is my sister in Christ, but I am happy to say she is also my friend. So, Deanne, I want to thank you for being here with us this evening. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Deanne. So Deanne began her journey to help clients out of her quest to know freedom, joy, and abundant life. Even while experiencing the heartache of dysfunctional relationships, she believes life is worth living. Deep within, she holds the capacity to experience both joy and sorrow. Emotions add color to life, and she believes the ability to feel emotions, complicated or pleasant, is one of the greatest gifts she is blessed to live out. As a counselor, Deanne seeks to create a safe space for her clients to wrestle with the pain and suffering they experience while offering compassion and hope. She brings empathy, honesty, and sees beauty in brokenness. Everyone has a story. Deanne specializes in helping clients find freedom by owning their stories, revisiting painful memories, and offering tools to develop healthy relationships. When she steps away from work or study, she is in the great outdoors, exploring the beauty of nature with her family and friends. Yes, she is. She loves to be out there sleeping out in the woods. I don't know why, but she loves to do it. Deanne is a leader, a sister. She is a caregiver, friend, and cheerleader for her nieces and nephews. She loves nature, humor, and a good cup of coffee. So everyone, welcome, Deanne. My sister Jackie sends a shout out to you, Dee, and thank you again for so much being here. So tell me where you practice. Tell me about your practice there, and what has drawn you to focus on trauma?
Yeah, Val, first I want to say thank you so much for having me on here to talk about trauma. It's just been an honor and a privilege to be in school with you, to be now colleagues with you, and what a wonderful friend. And I'm so excited to do this for you. I practice at the Peacemaker Center in Downingtown, and we are a fairly large size team of counselors. We have offices in about six different locations, I think, with Downingtown and Westchester. We're in King of Prussia, Kennett Square, Fort Washington. I think we're even in Coatesville. So we just have a wide team and faith-based practice. And I love my team. I love working with the team, and our heart really is to care well for people. We have a lot of people who specialize in trauma, and part of that is one of the reasons why I also have an interest in trauma, is because those around me, that's what they specialize in, and that's what we care deeply about.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Deanne. So listen, every once in a while, there is what I call buzzwords that are bandied about, and trauma has become sort of one of those buzzwords. But there still seems to be some misunderstanding and a lack of clarity regarding trauma. So define what trauma is, and also tell us what trauma is not.
Yeah, that's such a great question, Val. Trauma, I think, is really a buzzword, and I hear it all the time. Oh, I was so traumatized. Oh, that traumatized me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I understand that concept, and I think one of the great things of why it's becoming a buzzword is because society and culture around us is starting to understand that trauma is something that happens to people, and it's
Yeah.
important and it's necessary to understand. But also, I think there's a lot of misconception that comes with the word trauma. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I think about trauma and what it is, there's kind of three different aspects to trauma. And one of them is it's an event or a series of events that happens that kind of is a physically or emotionally harmful or life threatening.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's an event that happens. There's an emotional response. That's the second part of trauma. There's an emotional response that happens to this emotionally or physically harming event. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's also a physiological response where our body reacts because it becomes overwhelmed by the information that we're taking in these
Yeah.
horrific incidents. Um, and so it's kind of three parts, right? It's something
Yeah.
happens, we have an emotional response to what happens, and we have a physiological response to what happens. And that, I think, is what trauma is. And um, it's hard for people to understand. When we say, oh, I was so traumatized, my first question then is to myself, if I would say that, or to someone who's saying, okay, I had this traumatic event happen. All
Mm-hmm.
right, so tell me about what happened, and then what was your response? Because you can experience a terrible scene, right? Like you can come up on a car accident that you
Mm-hmm.
weren't a part of, and
Yes.
see that and feel traumatized by seeing it. But the person who was in the accident has happened to them, and they probably have had a physical response, and they probably have had an emotional response to what's happening, and
Yeah.
especially the severity of what has happened.
Okay. Thank you for that. And you know what? You mentioned about an event or a series of events. And now this is something that the individual could have had happen to themselves or actually witnessed. Is that correct?
Correct. So
Mm-hmm.
um, when I think there's kind of like a continuum of things that we experience. So
Mm-hmm.
let's say I'm driving down the road and I see a car accident and I don't know the person at all.
Yeah.
It can definitely leave an impact on me,
Mm-hmm.
and I can feel a little shaken up by having witnessed that. I mean, that would be normal because we don't like to see near death experiences.
Yeah.
But if I am driving down the road and I come up on a vehicle and I immediately recognize that vehicle as one of my siblings, it's going to have a different response to me.
Mm. Okay.
And then if it is a younger child who has experienced something and it's someone who is their caregiver, that's going to have even a more profound impact on
Mm-hmm.
how
Mm-hmm.
they experience that. So it can be something that has happened to me, or something I've witnessed happen to someone I care about, and
Mm-hmm.
or something I've just witnessed. Like, I mean, people, we talk about war veterans, they see terrible things.
Yeah.
um, but so there's kind of a continuum of what has happened and what you've seen. So it doesn't have to be just that it happened to you. It's also something you may have witnessed.
Yeah. Okay. And it's interesting you mentioned also a series of events. So it's not just that this it's not always that this one thing happened and boom, you are traumatized by it. It could be something that happens and happens and happens and happens over the course of time.
Yeah, and I think you're kind of starting to tease into what we'll probably get into is
Mhm.
what is trauma, what is
Yeah.
PTSD, but then there's
Yes.
this new term that's floating around in the psychological world, in the um that is called complex trauma. And
Yes.
what is
Yes. Yes.
complex trauma? And so when we start talking about series of events after events after events over a long term, and you think of someone who grew up in an abusive home, an abusive environment, and over and over again, their safety was violated, and they saw horrible things happen in their home.
Mhm.
Either they experienced them or they saw it happen to one of their caregivers. Then
Yeah.
we're talking about a more complex trauma, and that's certainly another layer to trauma.
Yeah. Okay, I want to give a quick shout out to Alicia. Hey, Alicia. To my daughter-in-law, Nini, Maggie Dunham is watching, and Dr. Danita. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in. So if you have the ability to share this so we can get some more people in, because I think this is a very, very important and impactful topic that we're going to be talking about this evening. So you mentioned PTSD.
Alicia, our classmate,
Alicia, our classmate, she's there.
Hey, Alicia.
So Dee, you mentioned PTSD. So
Yes.
what is the difference between trauma and PTSD?
Okay, so PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a very kind of a specific set of symptoms and reactions to a traumatic event that can happen. When someone, like someone has a near-death experience, or someone has, whatever that traumatic event was, there's a certain reaction that would be kind of considered a normal response right away, right? Like, you have a near-death experience, your body gets supercharged with emotion, you get a physiological response, because that is a normal response to an overwhelming situation.
Yeah.
PTSD develops, however, kind of when those things don't resolve within within a little while. So actually, first we get acute stress disorder. So within 3 days, if that physiological and emotional overwhelm doesn't kind of settle down and resolve, we're within 3 days of something happening, you're starting to see acute stress disorder. And acute stress disorder gives you about 3 days to 4 weeks, where again, there's kind of a normal response to a terrible event happening, like something horrific, right? But then once you get when that continues to go on for more than a month, now we're talking about PTSD. We're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, where your body hasn't kind of settled back in, hasn't it hasn't really been resolved, and you can't go on with life as normal. And so there's very, very specific symptoms that PTSD would have, and that's kind of those intrusive symptoms of if and I've been using the example of a car accident, but if we go say a car accident and you can't get in your car and drive, there's too much fear 4 weeks later, or when you're driving and you come to a red light, and that's what happened, like someone ran into you at a ran through a red light, and you get this sudden flashback and you're back in the moment. So now we're talking about intrusive symptoms that are happening where you can't go on with normal life after some time after it's happened. And then there's also kind of the emotional response to that, where you can end up you just stop, you stop getting in vehicles, you're not going to go anywhere, you're going to stay in your house, you avoid certain things because of the fear of that replaying in your life, right? So that's and I could go into, there's a lot of symptoms, and the DSM talks about all of them, but they're kind of there's physiological ones, there's emotional ones, and we end up having this avoidance or this need to numb out, or this and that's where you start to see other things tied into PTSD, where there's an avoidance of anything that would stimulate that memory, or anything that would stimulate this happening again, right?
Yeah.
So and it can change your mood. Like, people end up being depressed, or begin to or there's a sense of persistent negativeness of I think sometimes in traumatic events you start to get this negative belief system around, I shouldn't have been there at that time. I should have known better. I should have known not to drive through that way to work that day. And you start to see some of that stuff happening.
Yeah.
And then you also can get a behavioral change, where you get angry outbursts, and you get reckless behavior or self-destructive behavior, all a way to kind of cope with the inner suffering and the pain that traumatic event has caused, and the intense fear and those reactions that it continues to play out long term after it has happened.
Okay. And I know you were making reference to some experiences that someone may have after this traumatic event, and something may happen to cause them to become fearful all over again. I think you're referring to where do triggers come in, and how do you define a trigger?
Okay, so like a trigger in if I use this car accident thing, the trigger would be like seeing a vehicle the same color, the same make, the same model, right? Like you see that vehicle and you suddenly have a flashback. That's a trigger, right?
Yeah.
Or you get to that intersection and every time you come to that intersection you have a flashback. That is another trigger.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, and then we can talk about emotional triggers and whether and if like what type of trauma it was, right? If
Yeah.
and if we're going to talk about more of a abusive trauma,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
because I'm using a pretty clear cut, this is a traumatic event, right? Like
Yeah.
a car accident. But if we're talking more of a relational style of trauma, then you're going to get more nuanced triggers. Someone may remind you of that person, and suddenly you feel angry, and that person who's abusive towards you, and you may suddenly feel angry and and it's like this overwhelming anger, and I have no idea why, because that person hasn't really done anything to you,
Yeah.
but they remind you of like internally it produced this memory of
Yeah.
someone or somewhere that you weren't safe.
And can triggers be anything that impacts any one of our five senses?
Yeah, I think so. So you can get triggered by any one of the five senses, and it all depends on what kind of event happened and
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
what senses were involved in that event. So whether something was something you saw something that was traumatic, whether
Yeah.
you heard something and saw something that was traumatic, right? And sometimes all five senses are involved, and so yes, triggers can be from any one of those senses. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's very important for people to understand, that you're not just triggered by something you hear. It could be something you see, something you smell, even a food that you taste may take you back there.
Yep.
I, in my younger years, experienced pretty significant sexual trauma. And during one incident, there was a particular song that was playing in the background. And for years, every time I heard that song, it was a trigger for me. It took me right back to that
Yep.
event. So
Yep.
I definitely understand what triggers are and how they can impact you emotionally. And when you experience a trigger, sometimes as if you are right there again. You have the same emotions that you felt. Whatever you were experiencing physiologically, you'll feel it again in that
Yep.
moment, when you are triggered by
Yep.
something that will take you back there.
So
So
that's
Dan,
kind of a
I'm
definition
sorry.
of a flashback. If
Let's
it's the
talk
right
about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
talk
So
about
yeah,
flashback
like
for a
like
minute.
back there, like so someone who's been, I can use an example of my life just recently where I was, outdoors adventuring, which I love to do, but I had a
Mhm.
very near death experience.
Mm.
And I would wake up in the middle of the night shortly after that and be panicking because what happened in my outdoor experience was I almost drowned. And so that feeling
Mm.
of almost drowning is a very panicky feeling. And so I'd wake up gasping, right? Like it was the same like being back in that moment of like coming up to the surface and like gasping for air. And
Yeah.
that's that flashback is like it's like you're there and then I would like stop and I would feel, I was waking up in the middle of the night with these flashbacks and you stop and I'd feel
Mhm.
the bed and be like, okay, I'm right here. Like there's a like centering yourself, touching, like I had to touch something and like put my
Mm.
hands on something and say, I'm here. I'm not in the water right now. I'm
Yes,
here. I'm
yes.
safe. I'm okay. That's kind of what a flashback is. And what you're saying is that song, and your body starts responding because
Mhm.
that's a flashback. You're starting to have that like that feeling of I'm back there, but you're really not.
Yeah.
But it feels that way, and it feels very true. And we've got to understand that for people who are going through these things because they feel like they're going crazy. They're not going crazy. Their body is just reliving something terrible
Mm.
that happened.
Yeah, yeah. That's good. That's good. So I think you may have touched on this already, but why do some people who experience trauma develop PTSD and others do not?
Uh, that's that's a deep question. I think that a lot of people have questions about, and I'm not sure that I can give you a solid yes, here's why. There's
Mhm,
certain factors that play into why some people might and why they wouldn't. I
mhm,
think
mhm,
some of them are environmental. um, so what kind of relationships do you have? Where was your like were you in a safe and secure environment before this traumatic event happened? Or if your environment isn't really safe, then
mhm,
something
mhm.
then you witness something horrible, you don't really have somewhere to go to be safe. And
Yeah.
so it's just a perpetuation of this out of control fear and nowhere to be safe and secure. um
Mm,
so so there's sometimes maybe a temperamental kind of like different personalities, different temperaments. Like I would assume are, well, some people are more sensitive to fear than other people. Um, and then there may be a physiological aspect to this. Like if you lived in a, you know, environment that wasn't safe for a good part of your childhood, like,
mm.
and now as an adult, you're in an environment that's safe, but some of that stuff was never processed. There may be some physiological aspects of your brain that still need some healing in the trauma. And so
Yeah.
when something would happen, it might make you more vulnerable to PTSD than someone who has a bit of a more secure base.
Okay. So what exactly is unprocessed trauma, and where does that fit into all of this stuff we're talking about here?
Okay, so unprocessed trauma, I think that's kind of a big question, and I think everybody um, ha- has different questions around this, and this is
Mhm,
where this is again a more nuanced question that's kind of hard to put a clear cut answer on. I'll do my best. I want to
mhm.
go back to one of the experts in the trauma field that I've really appreciated her teachings and her writings on trauma. Talks about like trauma it is and it involves intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and a threat to life, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And to live through trauma is to experience something that's so horrific it's unspeakable.
Mm,
So so unprocessed trauma to some extent is something that's never been spoken about, but probably
mm.
because it's unspeakable.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and when something so horrific happens, it silences the ability to find words for it
Mm,
or to
yeah.
describe the experience.
Mhm, mhm.
And so when an individual has no words to process what has been experienced, they kind of become trapped because they need to speak about the trauma to move on. And at the same time, they are unable to speak about it.
Unable to. Wow, wow. That's a serious catch-22 right there,
It
because you
is.
need to speak about it to start the healing process, but just the thought of speaking about it, um, is stressful. And like you said, you don't always have the words to describe it, because with some things, like you said, are so horrific. We don't have the vocabulary. Yeah, Caleb is saying unspeakable. We don't have the vocabulary to describe it. And then there's a part of us who, that we're not ready to talk about it, but we need to talk about it in order to get the healing process started.
Yeah.
So that's powerful. That's
Yeah.
powerful.
So one of the things that happens in an unprocessed trauma, um, this can be in many forms. A common form is a young child experiences horrific horrific things at the
Hmm.
hands of either caregivers or other
Mm.
people who should have been safe
Yeah.
in their life. Um, but they don't have the brain developed,
Mm.
right? Because when we're working with children at young ages, we're trying to teach them words, we're trying to teach them vocabulary, we're also trying to teach them to understand emotions, like all of this stuff that their brain is
Mhm.
just grappling with and trying to understand. But they so like so something horrific happens to an adult whose brain is fully developed, and it's
Yeah.
so horrific you lose words, right?
Hmm.
Like I
Hmm.
cannot speak about what has happened. And I think how much more difficult that's got to be when that has happened at a young developmental age, where they've not been able to process, not been able to speak, and and yet they need to. But when we lose that ability to speak, we lose the connection that happens through communication, and so connection is lost.
Yeah.
There's already a high level of fear and now isolation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So isolation is inevitable, right? If trauma is unspeakable and yet necessary to speak of to connect with another person, and yet I can't do that, there's this, not only do we have fear, but now we have isolation because I can't speak about what has happened to me. And so that's a lot of times, I think, underneath the surface, and let's be honest, nobody wants to talk about things that are so horrible that have happened to us. That's so hard to do, and yet we need to do that.
We need to do it
in order to heal.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna read a quote from Diane Langberg. I really like how she describes it. She said, "Not only must the indescribable be described, but that which so powerfully isolates one human being from others must be uttered in the context of relationship if healing is even ever to occur."
I like that. I like that. Read that again. Read that again.
Not only must the indescribable be described, but that which so powerfully isolates one human being from others must be uttered in the context of relationship if healing is ever to occur.
Wow. That's a very powerful statement.
You see the catch-22 people are in. You see the rock, hard place, me, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
if that's unprocessed trauma, because it's never been spoken of, it's never been told, it's never been validated and cared for and understood, and so the person feels alone in their suffering.
Yes. Yes.
And so when we talk about complex trauma, why would I risk again when, like, over years I've been emotionally abused or whatever? Like, it is incredibly hard and incredibly challenging. And I think clients who have sat in my care, I always walk away with I marvel, I think is the word, at their courage. It takes incredible courage.
And there's a word that you used a few moments ago when you talked about being validated. I would imagine that is so important to have what your experience to be validated. And who is the first person that's going to validate it? Is it going to be someone with whom you have a connection and a relationship with, or is it going to be your counselor? And does it matter? And what's your take on that?
Well, ideally, it should be someone who's in your life who you have a deep connection with. Ideally. That doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. And a lot of times, there's many people who have experienced horrific things, and then they go and tell one of their parents, and they're like, "Don't say that."
Yes. Absolutely.
It didn't happen. No, that didn't happen. Don't say that. Don't ever say that again. No, like, ideally, it should be someone who is in your life, who you're connected with. That doesn't always happen. And part of, like, why I'm so grateful you're doing this, and why I'm so passionate about talking about trauma is, let's understand what people need, because it doesn't need to be a therapist, it doesn't need to be a counselor.
Right.
You can listen and you can understand if you're willing to. Right? I think the hard part about it is we all, as human beings, really, really, really struggle with suffering, and we don't want to hear suffering.
Yeah.
We don't know what to do with it.
Don't know what to do with it. Yeah. And then that the question is, when someone shares that with you and you have heard these horrific experiences, then the question is, what do I do with this? What do I do when someone has shared all of this with me? Um, and most people have no clue what to do. They have no clue. And sometimes all you really need to do is that word you used earlier, is to validate the experience and not minimize that experience or act as if it didn't occur. And like you said, so many of us, after having had traumatic experiences and having told someone like a parent who didn't validate it or didn't believe it or who minimized it, that kind of uh, creates this reluctance to ever want to share it again.
For sure. Because
Yeah.
a lot of times when it's not validated, it only enhances the shame that it happened to me in the first place and the
Yeah. Yeah.
judgment of you
Mm.
shouldn't have allowed that to happen to you.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
small children who are abused at the hands of fathers or parents, I mean, we're not talking, I mean, we're talking anybody, any caregiver,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
others, like, and then their experience isn't validated, then something must be wrong with me.
Yes. Yes. Or did I make it up? Was it a dream? Did this really happen? You
Well, I
begin to
think that goes,
question.
that goes down the line, right? Like that's where we end up going
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
because like you have to kind of separate yourself from what happened to survive. Your little brain, your
Yes.
little self would not survive.
Yeah.
So there's a
That's
denial and a separation, and then that's when we can start talking about dissociation and kind of some of that stuff that goes on, and then you get
mm,
into repressed memories and all of that. And that's a
yeah.
whole other topic that we are probably not going to have time for. But but it
But
is
touch on it a little bit. Touch a little bit on dissociation and repressed memories. Just tell whoever's listening a little bit about it.
I think dissociation is maybe a necessary evil and a necessary good.
Mm-hmm.
It's necessary for a young child who has been severely abused, whether that's sexually, physically, emotionally, spiritually, or all of them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because their brain doesn't have the capacity to process that level of suffering. It's not
Yes.
developed enough. There's not words for emotions. It's just felt physical experiences, right? And and so if that has happened at a young age, then you can kind of they learn to kind of check out
Mm-hmm.
or separate themselves from it. And so it
Mm-hmm.
was something out there, right? Because children have great imaginations
Yeah.
and they can and so they can kind of we all can do this, so like all of us dissociate, like there's a continuum of dissociation. So go back to our college days, and when we're sitting in class and we're getting a little bored and like and not that our professors were ever boring, but you know sometimes we just are overwhelmed, right? like
I started to say, speak for yourself, sister.
well, you know, shout out to professors at Karen who have taught me a lot of this stuff. I am
Yeah.
so appreciative. A lot of this stuff that I'm, saying here is stuff I've learned at, as they've taught me. And so I'm
Yeah.
super grateful. But like, let's say we're sitting in class and, and I'm overwhelmed
Mm-hmm.
or I'm bored. And so I can do this little thing of, and I start thinking about what I need to do the next day. I've just dissociated myself from the present.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so that can become more and more pronounced in more um, severe trauma. You have to do that, like check out and there's stories of people who say, yeah, it's like I was watching my body, it's like
Yes.
I'm here and I'm just watching my body and watching this happen to my
Mm.
body. And it's necessary,
Yes.
right? Necessary. But to move towards healing, we've got to
Mm-hmm.
reconnect that
Mm.
that mental experience to your body. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I'll touch on this when we get into kind of treatment of trauma. But
Yeah.
part of it is connecting the two sides of the brain and helping the body calm down and to be able to move more and more to being present and
Yeah.
aware of my body.
That's great. And I always marvel at the ways in which God created our bodies.
Absolutely.
I marvel at it because, just as you said, it's a necessary evil and a necessary good. So it has a place, it has a purpose. And God created our minds and our brains in such a way that it has the capacity to do that. To
Yeah.
me, that is just awesome. To me, that is absolutely awesome, and just speaks to, for me, it speaks to how much God loves us, that He created us in a way that maybe over the long term it's not healthy, but for the moment it saves you from losing your mind and going crazy. So you're able to function, and you're able to go from day to day and do what needs to be done to get you through that experience. So
Right.
I always marvel at that.
It's incredible what the brain can do. And it's also like this miracle that I see, and I'm so thrilled about. I mean, people say, why trauma, right? Like, why would you want to work that? Because trust me, it is some of the hardest work out there. To
Yes,
sit with the self.
absolutely. Yes.
But also, there is incredible healing that can happen at the physical level of the brain, the emotional level and the spiritual level that words really cannot describe.
Yeah.
But that God gave the brain capacity to do that so that you could survive is phenomenal.
It's phenomenal. Absolutely. I want to give a quick shout out to Bryn, our classmate, Bryn. Bryn, thank you for watching. Connie, she's someone I went to high school with down in North Carolina, Connie Reynolds. Caleb, who says he's watching from Nigeria, West Africa. Thank you so much, Caleb, and share this when you can. Lisa Hopkins, Jose, thank you guys so much for watching. My daughter-in-law, Liz, Anu, a co-worker from the Philadelphia VA. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate it. Share this video because it's a very, very important and impactful subject that we're talking about. So you kind of started talking about some of the treatment modalities for trauma and PTSD. So speak some more about that.
Okay, yeah. So I think the trauma's become this huge topic, right? And this big buzzword, and this is the part where I there's hope. There's so much hope, and we are seeing new research every day.
Yeah.
I mean, trauma is becoming this highly researched thing, which started with PTSD with war veterans, and now we're starting to go. Now the field is saying, hey, there's this thing called complex trauma, and then we see the medical field and the psychological field come together and say, hey, there's these things called adverse childhood experiences that are seriously impacting people's mental health, and they're also impacting their physical health, and so there's a lot of research happening, and so then there's also ways that we can treat trauma and move towards healing. And so part of the question that we often get is, can it be resolved? Like, can PTSD be resolved? Can trauma be resolved? And my first resounding answer is yes. Yes, yes, yes. Praise the Lord, yes, right? Or what am I doing? Right?
Right.
But at its core, trauma is an isolation and fear. And at our core as human beings, God created us
with that connection
and safety.
Yes.
Connection with Him. He is never changing. He is consistent. I realize as I'm saying this, some of the people who have experienced trauma don't feel that right now. Don't experience that to be true, but it is true. He is consistently loving, consistently compassionate, and consistently kind.
Yes, yes.
And praise the Lord, He is. So when we talk about treatment for trauma, there's multiple ways we can treat trauma. I think one of the probably the most effective ones that I know of is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, short version is EMDR.
Mm-hmm.
And that one really um, is retelling the story, but
Mm-hmm.
retelling it in such a way. And how it got this crazy name, right, is the lady who kind of came up with EMDR was walking, I think, by a cornfield or through a cornfield, and was realizing that her eyes, like as the stalks of corn, right, like there was something comforting about walking down this row. Like there's this
Mm.
sensation
Yeah, yeah.
of that's calming, right? Um, so eye movement desensitization reprocessing is really um, working with the physiological response to trauma while retelling the story. So part of what happens in trauma when we talk, and I said when it's unspeakable, part of what happens and why it's unspeakable is it was so horrific. The brain, with the logical way of processing it, shuts down to
Mm-hmm.
survive, right? To survive. And and then the emotional side and the amygdala, the fear center, gets super activated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and so your right side of your brain and your left side of your brain, like they need to be working together for things to be functioning well and healthy. And so eye
Yeah.
movement, EMDR is really trying to get both of those sides of the brain to work together, while reprocessing the story of what's happened that needs to be
Mm-hmm.
told. Um, so on one hand, some people who've been through a really traumatic experience can kind of just give you all the details, and they'll give you kind of a this happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's like no emotion, and you're going, this is such a horrific thing that you're telling me, and you're just saying it in such a flat tone. Well, that means the logical side of their brain stayed online when it happened, and the emotional
Mm-hmm.
side shut.
Yeah, yeah.
Then you can get another person who has had something terrible happen to you, and they cannot speak, but they just weep and they shake and they tremble. And that means that when their traumatic experience happened, their logical side shut down and their emotional side stayed online. And so they felt and
Yeah.
experienced it all. So when we're doing EMDR therapy, what you're trying to do is the eye movement. And so it started out with like moving, a therapist will move a finger kind of from one eye to the other, because as you stimulate each side of the body, it keeps the
Mm.
brain activated. So as you
Mm-hmm.
stimulate the right side of the body, it keeps the left brain activated, and if you stimulate the left side of the body, it keeps the right brain activated.
Yeah.
um, so there's different ways to do that, but some people use kind of like these little things that you hold in your hands and they vibrate, and as you're telling the story, and it keeps your brain activated, and they do it in a way that just it keeps you safe and keeps you and then always coming back as you tell the story to bring you back to the present and remind you you're here and you're safe. It's okay.
Yeah.
So that's one way to kind of get that brain reconnected, that eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Mm-hmm.
Really effective. Really effective for kind of like those events that happen, like a car accident or a near drowning, like I had, where then you kind of you have these memories in it, and it helps get the brain connected to be able to tell the story and make sense of what has happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's one way. Lots of shout out to the Peacemaker Center. Lots of people there are trained in that, and so would be happy to help you if if that is something you're looking for. Um, there's many. This is the neat thing about God. There's no one way He heals,
Yeah.
and
Wait, say
there's
that again. Say that again.
no one way He heals, right?
Praise.
So
Yes.
So multiple ways of therapy that can work.
Mm-hmm.
Internal family systems is another one that kind of deals with the fragmented parts of self that
Mm-hmm.
have happened through probably chronic abuse and certainly childhood abuse, and people kind of go, what is that, like this, what are you talking about, parts of self? And to really simplify it, I say, um, okay, you ever have like, there's something you want to do someday, and you go, part of me wants to go do that, but part of me wants to sit on this chair and relax, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we all understand the parts of ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
To some
Mm-hmm.
degree, but they can become pretty fragmented inside, And so the guy who created internal family systems really began to see the parts of self as an internal family that was in operation. And so beginning to get them to be less dysfunctional internally and work together. And a lot of
Mm,
that fragmentation that's has happened through trauma.
mhm.
And so that's one way to deal with um, through probably more, long-term trauma. I don't know that that parts of self would be as affected with kind of a traumatic event that you're, struggling with. But
Yeah.
there's the other option of prolonged exposure therapy. I tried this one. Very effective, very terrifying at the same time. And that is, I was canoeing when I almost drowned. And so a couple of weeks later, I signed up. I didn't sign up. I told myself, you're going out canoeing again for 3 days and you're going to go do the same kind of rapids you almost drowned in. And you're
Mm,
going to take someone who's very experienced and very, you know, will be able to help me navigate that. And so the first set of rapids I hit, like, I like freeze, like, and she's talking to me, and I'm just like paddling because I
mhm.
know that's what I have to do, but that's all I can do. Right. And so as the weekend progresses and we keep going through rapids, and this is the really cool thing. The last day we went through a set of rapids, and I remember as I was finishing, I was laughing.
Mm,
I was no
mhm.
longer frozen in fear about this thing
Yes.
that I used to love but had almost taken my life.
Mm, mhm,
And
mhm.
after 3 days of kind of paddling together, um, then I was back to laughing
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
enjoying myself. And so that's kind of a prolonged exposure therapy, slowly exposing yourself to the events that were traumatizing,
Yeah.
um, and continuing to expose yourself to them. Because the thing was, I didn't want to lose my love of canoeing, right?
Yeah.
Um, and if I didn't get like if I didn't get I if I didn't get back in a canoe before the end of the season, there's a good chance that I would always have a fear of getting back
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
So
Go ahead.
I want to ask, um, the exposure therapy. It sounds as if it would be more appropriate and effective for certain traumas and not for others.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
again, that could be more, that can be certain kinds of trauma. Um,
Yeah.
I would think, okay, let's take someone who has a pretty strong PTSD reaction to vehicles, to cars after having been in a car accident. So
Mhm.
prolonged exposure therapy, I would, you probably want to start with them like the car is parked here, it's not moving. Can you at least open the door and sit in the seat for 30 seconds?
Yeah.
You know, can you? And now, like, it would be more effective for certain kinds of trauma, like the like long term complex trauma, probably
Not so
not a good
much.
fit.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then I mean, you can do cognitive behavior therapy, like separating out the negative thoughts that got associated to the traumatic event.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
you know, unpacking the story, finding out the truth of what happened, because what we tell ourselves about what happened and what actually happened can be very different.
Different. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and and so I mean, there's a lot of options. There's not one way, and I feel kind of like I shouldn't have started on this list because I'm going to miss some. But
You can just use a disclaimer that it is not an exhaustive list, and
yeah,
there are many different ways in which trauma and PTSD can be treated effectively.
yeah, yes, many ways, and even just in talk therapy, sometimes it can be treated. Telling the
Yeah.
story, feeling validated, getting the narrative out there, having someone understand and help you sort out the physical, emotional responses, and
Yeah.
many ways to deal with trauma.
Okay. So, Dee, I have to ask you this question because sometimes Christians, born again believers who are dealing with PTSD or dealing with trauma and the aftermath, they're led to believe that all they need to do is pray or to seek to be delivered from whatever symptoms they are experiencing. Now, I know that you are also a Christian, you're a woman of strong faith. So, how do you speak to that?
Ooh. That's a deep, deep question.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think first I'll say I'll repeat what I said before. Humans don't do well with suffering. And so if someone has been told to pray and seek deliverance and that's the way they will be healed,
Mm-hmm.
they received a human response to their suffering and not the heart of the Father.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, his heart is to heal, but he doesn't heal in one way.
Yeah.
And he doesn't always heal overnight. He doesn't always heal just because we prayed. And there is no I have this one prayer and it works every time. No.
Right. 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 Right.
You know, the heart, and I think maybe I missed this when we got started, but one of the things that has drawn me to trauma so much is because the heart of the Father is revealed
Mm.
where we suffer
Mm-hmm.
the most.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Say that again.
The heart of the Father is revealed where we suffer the most.
Yes, I like that.
He's kind, he's compassionate,
Mm-hmm.
he's
Mm-hmm.
tender, he's gentle, he's loving, he doesn't pressure,
Yes. Yes.
and he weeps with those who weep.
Mm-hmm.
He does.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus suffered the most severe trauma anybody could ever experience
Mm-hmm.
when he was nailed to the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bible says he could have called for angels to deliver him, but he didn't. And praise God he didn't,
Yeah.
because that means
Yeah.
he understands you and me when we are deeply suffering.
Yes. Definitely understands. And I'm going to harken back to what you said earlier. Is that there are many different ways in which uh, God can heal us. Now, it's wonderful if someone can go to a deliverance service and receive prayer and their healing. Hey, Ben, and their healing is instantaneous. But that doesn't always happen, and I think it is an unfair, unrealistic expectation for that to happen for every single individual,
Yeah.
because
It was that easy.
more often than not, the healing is not instantaneous. It is more incremental
Yeah.
over the course of time. And I think sometimes we can do damage, emotional damage to people when we tell them that is all you need. Just do that and nothing else. And then when they are not healed after this one prayer or after this one deliverance service, then they may tend to start believing, well, it's my fault. Something was wrong with me. Maybe I didn't say the right words when I prayed. Maybe I didn't pray the same way. Maybe I was standing up as opposed to on my knees when I prayed. As opposed to this is not the way in which God is going to use to heal me. Just because Susie Q was healed that way doesn't mean that Valerie's going to be healed that way. And it also doesn't mean that God's not going to heal me. God will just use a different mechanism, different methodology to heal me than he used for Susie Q.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and here's where the example of Jesus in the Gospels, right? He
Mm-hmm.
healed multiple blind people, but he didn't do it the same way.
He didn't do the same way each time.
He didn't
Absolutely.
do it the same way each time. He healed multiple
Mm-hmm.
people. He didn't do it the same way each time. But here's the question I've often heard: what about all the other people that were present in those cities that never got healed?
So true. So true. So
And
true.
and you know, when humans don't know what to do with suffering, when we don't know what to do with suffering, we try to fix it.
We try to fix it.
Look
Yeah.
at Job. Just look at the story of Job. And this has blown my mind for years. Those men who are his friends came to sit with Job, and they sat for 7 days. I don't know, I could be silent that long. And they didn't say a word for 7 days. And still, after 7 days, when they opened their mouths to speak to Job in his present suffering and in his trauma,
Mm-mm.
they still said the wrong things.
Yeah. As do we very often.
As do we.
Humans very often say the wrong thing at the most unopportune or inopportune, I don't know which is the correct way to say that word, but at the worst moment to
Right.
say the very worst thing because we think that we are being helpful or we want to fix it. So Dee, let me ask you this question. How can the spouse or significant other of a trauma survivor or someone who was diagnosed with PTSD be supportive? And what are some of the things that they should not do?
I think the first and foremost thing is be a safe person, be present,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
be patient.
Mm, yeah.
Every person's experiences of trauma is their own personal experience, and we cannot understand. See,
Yeah.
no, like two people, as was the case with me in my near death experience, two people went through the same thing and
Mm-hmm.
had very different responses, very different fears in the process.
Yeah.
So be patient and try to understand
Mm-hmm.
and live with so much grace. I think a lot of times the reason, we want to fix things, we hate to see suffering,
Yeah.
but we can't fix this.
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm.
The best way is to listen, to be patient, to be kind, to be safe, and allow them to tell the story when they can tell the story. Allow
Yes.
them to say that. And so the thing to not do is to not pressure,
Mm.
not attempt to fix it, and certainly do not dismiss what has happened. Oh, it's no big deal. No, to
Yeah.
them, the reason they're suffering and they're struggling right now is because it is a big deal, and it
It is
needs
a
to be
big deal.
it needs to be
Yeah.
validated. And so I would say to someone who's walking with someone in trauma, it's very, very hard, um, because we don't understand, and our heart to connect feels torn when someone's suffering and we don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just remember, tears are okay, and silence is okay,
Mm.
and anger is okay, whether that is yours or theirs.
Yes.
Like big emotions are okay, tears are okay, and silence is okay. Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they're just not words. So
Yeah.
part of trauma, a part of walking with someone within trauma is grief. A lot of times there is this happened and now there was a before and there's an after.
Yes.
And they feel
Yes.
like life will never again be the same because it might not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So learning to walk in the suffering and in the grief with them and understanding that there was a before and an after,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because that's part of the process.
Yeah. That's really good. And I think the thing you said about the other person, the significant other or the spouse, being a safe individual to share this information with, because if someone who has experienced trauma does not see you as a safe person, they're not going to share their story with you. They're not going to say anything. And
Right.
for those of us who have experienced trauma, um, I know I'm gonna speak for myself. It's one of the things I longed for. I longed to have a person that I really could share this with, because actually, my husband was the first person that I shared all of my sexual trauma with. He was the very first individual that I shared absolutely everything with. And I am so happy to say that he was a safe person, because he didn't dismiss, he didn't minimize, he validated what I was feeling, and he was very present. But I mean, I took a risk because it could have gone in a totally different way. I shared with him. Um, I was kind of forced to share with him because of some of the ways in which I reacted and responded to him based on the traumatic experiences. And he
Mhm.
used to wonder, Val, what the heck? What's going on?
Right.
And it took me a while, but I eventually had to explain why I reacted and responded in some of the ways that I did. But being patient, just like you said, being patient and being safe, and allow the person to tell their story their way.
Right.
If there are starts and stops, if they tell you a little bit today and a little bit tomorrow and a little bit a month from now, let them tell it their way. Don't
Yeah,
rush
that's a
them to
very
just get
key
it all
point.
out.
That's a very key point. I think one of the misconceptions about telling traumatic stories and getting it processed is we think that it needs to all get out, right? And then you'll be fine.
Yeah,
No, they need to tell it on their timeline, in their way, when they feel
yeah.
safe enough. In fact, if they process something and
Mhm,
are pressured or forced to say something too soon, they
mhm.
will re-traumatize themselves, because the number one step in trauma work is safety and stabilization.
Safety.
There needs
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
a safe relationship. So don't pressure, because if you're going to pressure them to tell you something, you're actually re-traumatizing that safety that needs to happen for them to tell this and to move forward in their processing.
yeah, yeah. So what would be your final words of advice or encouragement for those who are dealing with trauma or PTSD and the people who love them?
I realize as we navigate trauma, as we navigate this topic, I feel the heaviness. This is not easy. Um, but I would not do this if I did not have hope.
Mm,
And so my final words are, there is hope.
yeah.
You can move beyond. You can be understood. You
Hmm.
can be heard and cared for and held by someone, whether that's a counselor or whether that's someone safe in your family or in your circle of friends. But you can move beyond what has happened. It takes courage, it takes tenacity at some points,
Yeah.
and it is difficult to hold on to hope. But for someone walking with someone, I would say celebrate the little wins.
Mm, yeah.
Um, and someday when you look back, because sometimes it's pee steps, and sometimes it feels like when you're working, especially with, like severe trauma, um, it feels like 2 steps forward, 4 steps back. Pee
Mm,
step forward, 5 steps back. But
yeah.
over the long term, look back and see 2 months down the road, are we still where we were right after it happened? No. And so
Hmm.
look at a bigger picture. And sometimes you have to look back from the long term and say, celebrate the small wins, celebrate the small steps, um, offer courage, uh, hope.
Hmm.
And I think most certainly for people who are walking with people who have been highly traumatized, severely traumatized, stay present, stay present, stay present. The Lord stays present with us.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And um, and really someday it will all be over, right?
Yeah.
That's the hope we hang on to. So I'll end with this verse, one of my favorites when I think about suffering. And it comes from Revelations 21, 3-5. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. See,
Hmm.
that's important. Be with them. They feel isolated and alone. Be with them.
Mm,
He will wipe away every tear from their eyes,
mm,
and death shall be no more.
hmm.
Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new.
Yes,
Amen,
yes.
amen. Amen.
I love that. Making all things new. Praise God. Praise God. There was a LinkedIn user whose name is not appearing. Be kind. She said, he or she is saying, be kind to yourself. Your trauma is unique.
It is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You don't have to be like anyone else. You don't have to try to heal like anyone else. Don't follow the path of anyone else. be you and heal the way that God intends for you to heal, whatever that looks like, and whatever amount of time that it takes, because it may not be and probably won't be instantaneous. So, those of you, if you or someone you know has dealt or is dealing with trauma, PTSD, you can reach out to Deanne. She's at deanne.weaver at the peacemakercenter.org. It's up on the screen. Deanne.weaver at the peacemakercenter.org. And thank you again so much, Deanne Weaver, my former classmate, my colleague, my sister in Christ, and my friend.
My
Thank
dear
you
friend.
so
Thank you,
much.
Val.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you, Val.
we're going to go take that hike. We're going to go take that hike.
That's the other thing we could talk about. I mean, ways to navigate trauma, and we were just doing much more of an educational piece, but that
Yeah.
seek beauty.
Yes.
When we're suffering and when we're in deep pain, we must seek beauty. Hiking is a part of it.
Hiking is definitely part of it. Yeah. And on a wide path for me, not too much forest, not too much
There's
woods.
beauty on wide paths too. There is.
All right. Thank
Well,
you
it's been
again,
a
Dee.
privilege. It's been an honor. I'm so grateful to be your friend and colleague. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yes.
You're doing a wonderful job. And
Thank
I
you,
appreciate
Dee.
the opportunity
All
to
right.
join you.
I love you, sis. I'll talk
Love
to
you.
you soon. So, those of you who are watching, I want to thank you again so much for being on the broadcast, for sharing this with us as we walk through our conversation about trauma. I think it's a very, very important topic. There are many of us. Thank you, Lisa. There are many of us who have experienced trauma ourselves, or we are in relationship with someone who has, and we need to know how to navigate that, as someone who has experienced trauma, as well as those who love us who have experienced trauma, whether you are a friendship relationship with them, whether it's a brother or sister in Christ, whether it's a relative, a spouse, whatever it is. Find out as much as you can, get as much information as you can, so that you will be able to support your loved one as they are going through this process and they are navigating how to deal with the trauma. So my friend who was on today is Deanne Weaver. She's at the Peacemaker Center. You can reach out to her at deanne.weaver at the peacemakercenter.org if you or someone you know is dealing with trauma and they need a safe space in which to unpack some of that stuff and begin their journey to healing. Again, this is your girl, Valerie Mason Chase, on behalf of Marriage Beyond the Breach. And this was another episode of Marriage Matters. And you might have said, well, Val, this is your platform is all about marriage. What does this have to do? What does trauma have to do with it? Well, I can tell you, as someone who experienced a lot of trauma in the past, has a whole lot to do with it, because you may not even know that you are in relationship with someone who has experienced trauma in the past and they have suppressed it, but it may come out in some of the ways in which they interact with you, or the things they say to you, or how they respond to certain other things. So getting informed can absolutely help you in your relationship. So yes, from my perspective, it has a whole lot to do with marriage, because like I said, I experienced a great deal of sexual trauma in my younger years. It had a very negative impact on my marriage to the Cookie Man, and I had to embark on my own journey of healing, my own journey of personal healing, and that helped us in our marriage. But I also had to explain to him and share with him what the trauma was. So again, thank you so much for watching. And Marriage Beyond the Breach, where we believe that when two people are committed to each other, committed to their relationship, committed to do the work, and they absolutely have God in the midst, that no marriage, no relationship is beyond redemption. God bless you, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.